Welcome everyone to our first webinar for the 2014 webinar series. Today's topic will be focusing on male, family and domestic violence. As frontline workers and professionals, you are faced with many barriers, and one of them is knowing how to read and respond to signs appropriately. We are here to help provide you with the tools and understanding on how to manage these sensitive disclosures professionally. Today, 1800RESPECT is glad to welcome your presenter, Rodney Vlace. Rodney is an experienced men's behaviour change program facilitator and practitioner. He is committed to providing training to community-based sector workers across family and domestic violence and to aid in prevention. Rodney is responsible for NTV's policy work practice development resources and interstate contracts. He successfully provided clinical psychology services in a range of contexts around Australia. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter at the appropriate times. Please note that case-specific information cannot be answered during this webinar. All other questions can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You will notice I have a question pending for you to answer. Responses to your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. After the session, you'll be directed to an online survey, which can help us to improve the running of our future webinars for you. We have already incorporated some great ideas from your feedback, so thank you and keep them coming. We also encourage you to participate in the discussion tool, which you will be redirected to after completing the survey. We will be closing this thread at 2:15 p.m, so jump on if you have any further questions that we may not have time for in the next 45 minutes. There are some useful links on this topic on the 1800RESPECT webinar page. We will send you out a link in a follow-up email so that you can share this with those that couldn't attend. I'd now like to pass you over to Rodney to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Anna, and hello, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that at least, I'm sitting on at this point of time, and I know that we're all in very different Aboriginal nations across Australia. But I'm currently sitting on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to acknowledge that the Wurundjeri people are the traditional and the sovereign owners as part of the Kulin Nation of the land that I'm on, and that there's much unfinished business to do to know what it means for myself, coming from a European colonial background, to coexist and co-manage Wurundjeri land and to give true respect and acknowledgement of both Indigenous, of both traditional but also actual sovereign ownership of the land. And I pay my respects to all Aboriginal elders and ancestors, all Aboriginal people who are participating in this webinar. Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, and today I'll really be focusing on trying to pull together two threads. One is I'll be picking up on previous webinars, looking at some of the techniques to help practitioners in a range of different circumstances to help to screen for family and domestic violence. Because I know that for so many of us that work in a range of different settings that we come across this quite commonly. And so just some refreshing on previous seminars about what it actually means to screen, and then once we have an indication that a woman that we're working with is experiencing family or domestic violence, what does that mean about what questions we ask? And what's appropriate risk assessment and risk management framework to support this front-end work with women experiencing family and domestic violence. But a large part of the webinar will be looking at men who perpetrate family and domestic violence, and what are some of the key principles and dynamics that underpin their use of violence. What that means for how we might respond to these men, again in our very diverse practitioner settings. We'll be looking briefly at determining the primary aggressor in situations where men present as victims. Because certainly for a significant proportion of men who identify themselves as a victim of heterosexual intimate partner violence, they actually are the main perpetrator or the sole perpetrator. So we'll be spending a little bit of time talking about what might be some of the indicators that can help us as practitioners to try to tease out whether we think the man really is a victim or not. And then finally, we'll look at appropriate referral options. In particular, a little bit about men's behaviour change programs as a referral option of choice, but also about what are some of the statewide based telephone counselling and referral services, so that for practitioners who may not be aware of where might be an appropriate men's behaviour change program to refer a man who's using violence, there can be a telephone number in at least some states in Australia where you can call and talk, have a useful secondary consultation with a specialised family violence practitioner who understands and works with men who use violence. And that can then help you to work out, well, what conversation could you then have with that man, with that perpetrator, to try to encourage him to phone the service and then be referred to a men's behaviour change program. And you'll notice I've already used quite gendered language. And that's because studies really throughout the English-speaking world, and my guess would be that it will be not different in many other Asian and African and Latin American and Pacific cultures, the vast majority of men who perpetrate the vast majority of people, who perpetrate intimate partner violence are men. And that, in my state of Victoria, there's been a significant statistical project that's drawn together sources of information from police, courts, hospital records, and some other sources of data that have found that when we look at family violence in its fullness, in approximately 80% of cases, women are the victims who are experiencing the violence, and that men are approximately 20%. But this is family violence in its fullness, and this includes situations where, for example, an adolescent male is using violence against a parent, not only situations of intimate partner violence. And so we find that with that 20% of Victorians through these statistics, of the 20% of the men who are actually experiencing violence, that sure, some of those men certainly are experiencing violence from a female partner or former partner in a heterosexual relationship. But there's actually a significant proportion of those male victims who are experiencing violence maybe from an adolescent son or a brother. And in fact, a higher proportion of men who are victims of family violence are experiencing that violence from a source other than an intimate partner than is the case for women who are experiencing violence. So it's certainly not to deny that men are victims sometimes. However, we find in the vast majority of cases when we're looking at violence as a pattern, as an attempt to control another person's life, to limit their life, to use fear, terror, and a range of different tactics to limit their life in order to enforce one's own privilege, the vast majority of times we're talking about a man as perpetrating that violence. And furthermore, some of the times when women are using violence in a heterosexual relationship against a current or a former partner, sometimes it is out of self-defense. Sometimes women who have experienced a range of different tactics the man has used over years and years to control her life. We know that women are not just passive victims, that they try their best they can to keep themselves and their children safe. And sometimes in order to try to keep a bit of dignity and out of frustration, they might occasionally use an incident of physical violence to try to assert a little bit of power and control in a relationship where they've got very little. But that doesn't mean that they're the one that's using a range of different tactics against him to control his world. It's often the other way around. So that's why I'm using quite gendered language. Now, we're now going to move to the first of three polls that we're going to have today, just to get a bit of a sense of who's participating and what some of your thoughts or experiences are with some of these issues. So with the first poll, I'd be really interested to know if you've already got experience in using screening questions with female clients when appropriate to attempt to identify family and domestic violence, acknowledging that I assume most of you aren't working as specialist family violence workers, but you've got a range of different things to use. I'd be very, very interested. Okay, so far I've got about 27 responses. So a number of you so far that have got experience using a screening tool. We'll just give a little bit more time for some more responses. Okay, so about 60%. 60% so far have used a tool, and about 40% haven't or haven't used screening questions. Okay, it seems as though that's probably most of you who've responded now. So yeah, so over half have had some experience in using screening questions, which is really, really, really fantastic to see. And I'm now going to go on and spend a little bit of time talking about the screening and identification process before we then move on to focusing more on men who perpetrate violence and their dynamics. So I'll just stop the poll for now, and let's move on. So one of the important things to think about when we're looking at screening and then trying to identify if a woman that we're working with, and for whatever the main presenting issue or the main presenting problem is the types of violence that person might be experiencing. And for many of you, I know this is already something that you know quite well. Our society and community quite often think about violence as just physical and sexual abuse. But we know, of course, that there are a range of other different types of violence and abuse that women experience. Emotional, spiritual, financial, and social. And what's really important here is for us to remember that these just aren't a list of different things. They're not just a list of different ways in which women experience violence. They're actually deliberate tactics that a man uses to try to assert his power and control over her and to try to get things his way. So, and I'll talk more about this later, so I'm not going to go into much detail now, but a man might be experiencing an emotion of jealousy. He might be thinking that she's the one to blame for making him jealous. It might be that all that she is doing is wanting to have friendships and social connections with high school friends or people who are important for her, and that of course may include some male friends. However, for whatever reasons, he has a strong feeling of jealousy or insecurity around that. Because of, well, speaking as a man, the privilege that we are given to us by virtue of being men, we can choose, often more than women, to decide to try to feel better and get rid of that feeling of jealousy by trying to control her world. And so this is where the range of different tactics come in. A man who's using family and domestic violence might then decide to frighten her so that she doesn't have conversations with other men. He might beat up one of her friends, one of her male friends in a nightclub. He may intimidate her, emotionally abuse her into being too afraid to speak to other men. He may use social violence tactics, checking up her mobile phone, looking at her email messages, or talking down at some of her male friends. He might try to limit her financial capacity to go out and possibly interact with other males. So I guess what I'm emphasising here is that rather than just a list of different types of violence, these are different tactics or different things that men can do to try to control their current or former partner's world. And the man has the privilege, unfortunately, given to him in society to just focus on his own feeling of jealousy and insecurity, to believe that he has the right not to feel this emotion and to think that she's the one who's causing him to feel this, and that therefore he is justified to use his range of different tactics to, in his thinking, stop her from making me jealous. Whereas, of course, what we want men to do is for us to take responsibility for our own emotions rather than blaming someone else. And to realise that even if we've got a very strong emotion that we're uncomfortable with, that never gives us the right to use violence against a woman to try to control her world, to try to stop her from exercising her fundamental human rights, just because we've got a feeling that we don't want to feel, and just because we feel that we're entitled for someone else not to make us jealous. So just a little example of how these different types of violence relate to each other. So moving on to what this means for identification and screening, I'm going to be drawing upon a Victorian family violence risk assessment and risk management framework. This is a statewide document backed up by quite a large investment and training from the Victorian government to help a range of practitioners to be able to screen and identify. And it consists of 3 practice guides. The second one is helping people when we may not be specialist family violence workers, but we've got a fair bit of time with a woman who's experiencing violence, to help us to look at some of the risk issues and to get a sense of the presence of risk towards her physical and emotional safety. And then the third one's a comprehensive risk assessment, which is for specialist family violence assessors to go to that next level of depth in the risk assessment and to determine to what extent might she be at risk of lethality, of being killed or experiencing severe violence, and then what are the risk management processes we need to use to respond. But for this webinar, I want to focus on the first of the 3 practice guides on identification and screening. And the following few slides are based on this identification and screening tool from the Victorian framework. So while those of you from other states, don't have this same framework for yourselves, I know there is one in Western Australia, comprehensive risk assessment and risk management framework, but I know for most states of Australia there aren't. Nevertheless, this can still be a useful document to guide some of your practice here. So one of the things that the practice guide does is it helps us as generalist practitioners or as psychologists or social workers focusing on a range of different presenting issues to be conscious of what might be some of the indicators of family and domestic violence. And that when we see some of these things on the screen now, from substance abuse through to anxiety, physical signs of violence, the range of different things here can help to alert us to the possibility of violence. And one of the things that I know a number of child protection practitioners are starting to grapple with here is that when they see, for example, a mum who might be not feeling very empowered as a parent, feeling depressed, anxious, maybe some neglect of the children, having real sleeping difficulties and physical health problems here, and who report difficulties in appetite, etc., that child protection practitioners are starting to think more about, well, could this possibly be a sign of the mum experiencing violence from her partner? And is part or most or even all of the reason why the children's welfare is being affected is because he has deliberately sabotaged her ability to be a good mum. That he has deliberately tried to drive a wedge in the mother-bond relationship and make it very difficult for her to be anywhere near the best mum that she can. So even if we're not family violence specialists, by trying to keep a clinical ear out for these different indicators, it can then lead us to think, well, is this a situation where I then should actually ask a screening question and take this the next step? And as in any clinical situation, when we're about to ask a potentially confronting and sensitive question, like when we're wanting to check out suicide ideation, for example, we often bridge into it with, I guess, a little bit of a softness so that the client is aware that we're going to ask them, one or two quite important questions here. So the bridging statement like, I'm a little concerned because I hear from you that, A, B and C, that, you're having real difficulty sleeping, etc., etc. Asking the client's permission to ask them some questions is, as we know in our practice, a very important way so that our clients feel as though that they've got some power and control over this interview. And then the Victorian Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework suggests some particular screening and questions and some follow-up questions to ask. The ones on the screen now are some examples of the ones that the Victorian Risk Assessment Framework in this screening and identification tool stresses. And the questions, cover issues such as fear. Trying to look at the controlling behaviours and the emotional violence too. Again, coming back to those different tactics that a man will use. Some women will report that he hasn't hit me, but I know he's capable of it and I'm very afraid of him. But it's the emotional abuse that really is having the impact, that my sense of worthlessness. Obviously threats. Trying to get at the physical violence and trying to be specific here rather than a general question, have you experienced physical violence from your partner? Well, that requires a client to abstract things. If we can be a bit more specific in our questioning, then it makes it easier for the person to respond yes. Because if I'm someone who is finding it difficult to really come to terms with the violence that I'm experiencing, because, perpetrators often blame their partners and say that it's her fault. You're not a good enough mum. Why you keep raising this issue again and again? If only you would make these demands of me, I wouldn't keep hitting you. It's a type of propaganda, and so women can take this on over time because of his propaganda. So it can take a while for some women to really come to the full terms of what they're experiencing from him. So if we can avoid the labels and go to the specific questions about, has he ever hit you? Has he ever pushed you to the ground? We may sometimes get more of the story. Children are important here, obviously. They're very, very, very important here. And sometimes we find too that men, particularly men who are amongst the most dangerous, will also harm or threaten or kill pets as well too. And I guess the concluding question here again is that invitation to open up a space for a bit of a conversation to continue. So now this leads into our second of the three polls for today. And say that you get to this stage of identifying family and domestic violence as occurring, how many of you feel some confidence about what to do next? We'll just give this some time. Okay, so far a range, but certainly amongst the people here, the practitioners in this virtual room, a reasonable degree of confidence about what's the next step. Let's give this a little bit more time. Yeah, so a range. I'll probably stop the poll now, but I think if we had have done this webinar 5 or 7 years ago, it would have probably been a different response. There has certainly been a real awareness of trying to improve general practitioners and us as psychologists, our ability to work. So just as a little snapshot, actually I think we'll move on to the next. Yep, just looking at the time. So let's spend a little bit of time on this, responses. Close that, thank you. So some key things here represented visually is that we're wanting to explore and spend some time asking about the effects of his violence on her and, if it's okay, her children. And obviously doing this as delicately is important. Some women feel it very, very difficult to talk about the effects of her partner's violence on her children because they can easily lapse into thinking that they're a bad mum. And of course, one of our clear messages is that she is not at all responsible for his violence, that he is totally responsible for the violence, not her. and that he's 100% responsible, and it's totally, unacceptable. So the key message that it's not her fault is very, very, very important here. Exploring the effects, but acknowledging that this can be a very, very difficult conversation, and even asking the question. We've been talking about this for a number of minutes now. How are you finding this conversation? Is this the first time you've spoken about this with anyone? So we're trying to open up a space for her to talk about the violence that she's experiencing, and in your settings, she doesn't need to talk about everything that she's going through. But having an opportunity for her to talk about at least some of his behaviours and some of the effects gives you an opportunity to validate, so that she knows that this is real, she's not going crazy, it's not her fault, and it helps her to start thinking that this is his responsibility. Emphasising that she has a right to feel safe is very, very important. And then moving on to the available services for her. This is critical before we start thinking about any sort of programs for him. And of course, many of you won't be speaking with him. You'll be supporting her, and that will be it. This is the main central thing, is helping her to identify and find appropriate services. And for some women who don't feel very powerful, who are taking on his propaganda that it's her fault, that's where the follow-up is important. And asking her is that, well, I've spoken a little bit about this family violence service. It's a few kilometres from where you live. When you leave this session, what might your thoughts be in contacting this service? Might there be some hesitations in contacting this service? So really exploring what her barriers might be, her concerns. And of course, sometimes when we feel that risk is high enough, we might want to actually facilitate that contact with the service, possibly even making the phone call in the room with her there. So now in the last few minutes before we open up for some questions, I'd like to spend some time looking at the dynamics of men's use of family violence, which actually touched upon a bit earlier in that example of jealousy, that men can easily start to feel that they're the victim. And that certainly in my experience, men use a combination of downright lying, self-deceit, that they're the victim, to actually try to present to others that she's the one who's being unreasonable here. I gave the example of a man responding to jealousy to explore issues of entitlement and anger, that part of the privilege that we have as men is that we can sometimes lapse into just focusing in about our own feelings and forget that she's in the room, forget that she's got a right to safety. And for many of these men, the single-minded, in fact it's tunnel vision, and let's go to the next slide, a couple of slides down I think. Yes, many men talk about in terms of tunnel thinking, that when they're leading up and building up to using violence, they're just really locked on to thinking that this is unfair, why is she doing this to me, why is she making me jealous, I've told her before not to talk to other men, and it's just a complete lock-on to their own thinking, and she is just completely invisible. That is part of the male entitlement, rather than actually thinking that, well, she's important here, she's got a right to safety, I don't want to destroy this relationship, I don't want her to be too afraid to speak her truth. Rather, there is a focus on his own thinking. And there are a range of other things around authoritarian beliefs, etc., which I won't go into now, that are also part of these dynamics. And just, really quickly, men develop these, beliefs and these ways of controlling women in order to make things easier for our own lives, because of a range of different reasons. There are so many things in our society which does actually embed patriarchy, that embeds male privilege. A number of social norms are built around that. And of course, men also have family of origin experiences that can contribute to that too. And what that means is that men, when they're using violence, they will very much tend to try to conceal their violence, minimise it, deny it, not take responsibility, blame her or other things. and also to pathologise the victim. She's got a mental health problem. She drinks too much. I've got to protect her. And look at what I'm putting up with. They will often do what we call give practitioners invitations to collude with their views that she's the one to blame. And that, as I've talked about before, is that this is intentional. It's an attempt to maintain things the way that they are, to get out of doing housework or to not have to talk about a particular feeling or experience they don't want to talk about. It's to try to create fear and control so that they can control the relationship and control their actions. And by doing this, it really basically violates women's human rights. Now, there are a number, just on the screen, which I won't go into now, a number of these different factors that can contribute to men's use of violence. I guess at Note of Violence for ourselves as a peak body for men's behaviour change programs in Victoria, we don't, though, see them as causes. And just to pick one, for example, we don't see alcohol as a cause of men's violence against women, but there is no doubt that it can increase risk and it can contribute. It's not a cause, but it's a contributing factor. But again, we come back to men's power and control as the real reason for men using violence. One of the things that probably won't go into depth about now in the webinar is some of the indicators that can help us when we have a man who is actually presenting as a victim. Gain a bit of clinical sense, a bit of clinical judgment as to, well, to what extent is he actually the victim here? And just to point one, and then we'll move on. There's a document that focuses on this in depth on our website, ntv.org.au. It's under the resources section, and it focuses on determining the primary aggressor. So you can go into more detail by looking at that. But we know, for example, that women who are experiencing violence often don't feel very empowered. They feel small because of his emotional abuse. So they're not likely to talk about their partner in aggressive terms. They're not likely to say, oh, what he's doing is wrong and he's got to stop his use of violence. They're more likely to excuse him. So if a man presents as a victim and he's saying, oh, this is not right, this is not fair, she's using violence against me and look, she's violating my rights, etc., perhaps an indication that he's really not the victim, because it's unlikely that a victim who is controlled by his partner is going to feel that strong and have that much power, put the responsibility where it needs to lie on the other person. So there's a range of different indicators there. So just finally, I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about men's behaviour change programs, and then we're going to close to have some space for questions. One of the key things about men's behaviour change programs as a referral option is that they're very different from anger management programs. We want men to be able to make different choices when they're experiencing an intense emotion, regardless of whether the jealousy comes from entitlement-based attitudes of women based on stereotypes of women, or regardless of whether it comes from poor attachment experiences or traumatised family of origin experiences. We want men to not just make a selfish, self-centred decision when they have an intense emotion. We want men to actually choose not to use violence, and that's why we differ. We separate out the emotion from the behaviour, and we call them men's behaviour change programs, because men can exercise a choice, even though it's going against a lot of our culture that supports images of hyper-masculine males. We want men to make a different choice when they're feeling these intense emotions. And we want men to realise that there's actually a lot for them to gain in their lives if they stop coercively controlling their partners. We want men to realise that if intimacy and trust is really important for them, for their children to look up to them as fathers, for their children, for their daughters to be safe, and for their boys not to grow up as men using violence against other women, that it's important for them to stop their behaviours that try to limit and control their partners' lives. But there is a lot for men themselves. So the the programs themselves, which I won't go into very much now, often involve an initial intake and assessment, group work with men, joint male and female co-facilitators, and partner contact, which is a very important part of the programs. They support women and support women's journeying to heal from the violence and in their safety planning, as well as working with the men to change the men's behaviour. The programs focus on a range of different things, and we'll just put this slide up very, very briefly. The programs often need to work with men over quite a period of time, and some men take years to change. Many men take many months. And certainly, to be honest, certainly a significant number of men who start this work in men's behaviour change programs don't change to a sufficient extent. They may stop some forms of their behaviour, but increase other tactics like emotional abuse to still try to control their partners. So it's not a silver, don't want to use the word bullet, it's not a silver flower gun or whatever that's going to stop all men's violence. But it is a referral option for choice for men who are using violence. And I think in the resources link that I think you've got through the website, there are telephone counselling services in Queensland, Western Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, where you can have secondary consultations with. If you've got a client, if you've got a man who's using violence and you're not quite sure how to have a conversation with him to try to encourage him to get to a program. And where you can also encourage men to call, where they can have a conversation with a telephone counsellor and be referred to a men's behaviour change program local to them. In WA, it's the Western Australian Men's Domestic Violence Helpline. In Queensland, it's called DV Connect. And in New South Wales and Victoria, it's a men's referral service. So I'll leave there now because there might be some particular questions that you wanted to ask. So I'll hand back over to see if there's some questions to respond to.
Thank you, Rodney, for that great presentation. The slide on how to approach the conversation was really helpful in setting the context for follow-up questions and a discussion with your client. Now, for those who have asked, we will make this presentation available in a follow-up email. And we are now going to open up for a few questions for Rodney to answer. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing the questions into the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Okay, so we have had a question come through for you, Rodney. The first question comes from Jasmine. So this question is, what can you, as a support person or family member, do with the victim if they do not want to seek help?
Yes. It depends on a couple of things. If you particularly think that the risk is at least moderate, it might be high, of her continuing to be harmed by the man's or perpetrator's behaviour. And if you've got an opportunity to continue supporting her, then I would try again with this conversation, maybe in the next session or a couple of sessions later. You know, I would say to the client or a family member who you're supporting, who knows the client and who is wanting to support the client, that, you know, because I'm definitely here that you're not wanting to talk more about this now and you're not wanting to seek help. I think because of what I talked about earlier, that I am concerned about how this might be affecting you, and I'm concerned about the risk that he does pose to you. I do feel a need to talk about this with you again at another time. I definitely hear that you don't want to seek help and you don't want to talk about that now, and I will respect that. But I'd like to check in with you at a later time in another session just to see if that changes for you. So I'd give myself permission to raise it again in the future, because certainly sometimes it does need to be raised a few times. I'd also be looking to give her at least some information about referral options. So I might say, look, I hear you're not wanting to seek help or to talk about this now, but I'd like to just give you information about a couple of services totally up to you if you want to leave them, but just in case you leave this session and tomorrow or the next day or next week you do feel as though that you do want to seek some help here. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about these services. So I'll give some printed information, but I'll very briefly just talk a little bit about the services so she knows what to expect if she does contact them. Great. There are other
great.
questions.
Thank you, Rodney. We are just waiting for some few more questions to come through. So everyone, just a reminder, if you would like to ask Rodney a question, please do so by typing your question into the chat box down the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And we have had another question come through from Andrew. So Andrew's question is, with regard to Linda Mills' book, Violent Partners, have you, Rodney, heard of it or read it? And in it, she develops a response to family violence that is to engage them in community-facilitated processes. And have you had any experience with that, and what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Anna. I'm afraid that I haven't heard of the book at all. So when we're looking at community-facilitated process, I'm just going to, I guess, use what I think that might mean. And Andrew, if I'm completely wrong here, because I'm only guessing, I really, really apologise. We find that it's safest in engaging men who use family and domestic violence not to involve others in the same room or the same context, at least for the beginning, the middle, and most of the end part of the work. The reason being is that if he and, say, his partner, former partner, the person who's using violence against, are in the same room, then she faces a very, very difficult choice. She's either got to say the truth about the violence that he's perpetrating against her, in which case she could be retaliated against. He could retaliate against her, because often men don't want this to come out to a practitioner or in public. So there's a real risk that he may physically be violent towards her if she tells the truth with him in the room, or she might need to really be quiet and not say the full truth of what she's experiencing because she's afraid of retaliation, in which case she has another very disempowering experience. So we often think that it's safer to support her and to work with him separately rather than bringing them together. There are some restorative justice processes and other community-based processes that might try to find a way of holding the man accountable to his promises to change. So, in some cultures, like in the Maori cultures, and I think also within some Aboriginal programs here in Australia, the community is an essential part of it, and what elders think, and the community processes to hold men who use violence who are accountable is important. I think the thing is that when might you start to do that, and how can you do that safely? How can you involve others in the man's life to try to hold the man accountable is something which it's got to be done very carefully and very cautiously, because it's so easy for the man to say that he's changed and for other community members to say that he's changed, but the change journey is very, very, very long, and often men will still pose a risk to their partners even when they're saying that they're changed.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rodney. We have also had another question come through from Michelle. She would like to know, is there anywhere that participants can find more information about male survivors of family violence?
So I guess a couple of different avenues for that. For male survivors, whether it's a survivor as a result of a intimate partner violence in a heterosexual relationship or same-sex relationship, or another male family member or female family member. These telephone counselling services that I mentioned before still also have some expertise in this as well. So our men's referral service for anyone from New South Wales and Victoria, if you have a client that you're working with who is saying that he's a victim, a survivor of violence against him, then he can still certainly contact these services. Another a source, because sometimes these services, the specialist family violence services that work with men, are in the best position to try to work out whether he really is the victim or the perpetrator. There's also in the United Kingdom, another country I know, but part of Respect UK, there's a male advice line. You just really got to Google male advice line Respect UK, and they run a telephone counselling service for men as victims. And they've got some documents there which you can read as well, underlining that too, because they set up that very carefully because they knew that a certain proportion of the men who are calling that men's advice line are actually going to be the perpetrators and not just the victims. But certainly those telephone counselling lines you can contact.
Fantastic. Now, we are running out of time, so we do have time for just one more question. However, if you do have further questions that we haven't been able to get to, if you are able to fill out the exit survey, you will be redirected through to a discussion tool where Rodney can answer all of your questions. So our final question here comes from Tamsin. Tamsin would like to, or the question here is, the feedback that we have had is that this question in effect characterises domestic violence as part of normal relationship conflict rather than a pattern of controlling and violent behaviour. Can Rodney explain the decision to use this language in the poster?
The poster. I wonder if that's referring to some men's referral service publicity, so I'm not sure. So, and I could be totally wrong here, Tasman.
Sorry, Rodney. I will clarify that for you. So this is in relation to the posters being distributed in New South Wales advertising the men's referral service.
Yes. So there were some initial posters there that did actually point to men's use of violence using a term relationship conflict. And that was a major error on our behalf, and we have withdrawn, we'll try to withdraw, and change that and replace that with other sorts of words. You know, relationship conflict is a very bad way to frame men's violence against women. I think part of the reason why that happened is that sometimes there's a delicate balance, particularly in opening up a service in a new state, around trying to market a piece of promotional information to men. So if we're fully honest about where we see men's use of violence against women and use the fullness of those terms in the promotional material, then men are likely to metaphorically fold their arms and not make contact. So it's a delicate balance all the way along. What language can we use that will try to encourage men to call who do not see themselves as using violence, who are blaming her, taking very little responsibility, but we still want them to make contact because we want to have an initial conversation, refer them to a program. But how do we balance that without being dishonest or to present the wrong sort of frame around this? And I think in that first attempt, which we've never done in Victoria, we've never used the term relationship conflict in our promotional materials here, that was a definite mistake in that balance. So we have corrected that in, I think, website and future promotional materials because it was pretty evident that that was not good language for us to use, and we knew that pretty much straight away. I hope that answers your question.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rodney. So it does look like, unfortunately, we are out of time for today's presentation. So thank you, Rodney, for answering all of those questions, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. We hope that you feel more confident in responding to disclosures presented to you by your at-risk clients. Please stay logged in to take our short online survey. At the end of the survey, you'll be provided with a link to our discussion forum where you can discuss comments. And please note that case-specific information cannot be posted in the online discussion, and Rodney cannot answer any case-specific questions. We thank you in advance for your feedback, and every comment is taken into serious consideration. Now, the next webinar that we will be hosting in the series is on family domestic violence, a national perspective, and the webinar will be presented by the Honourable Andrew McIntosh, MP, who was formerly the Minister for the Corrections, Minister for Crime Prevention, and Minister for the Anti-Corruption Commission, and that will be held on Thursday the 20th of March 2014. So visit our website for upcoming webinars this year. We do have some equally compelling presenters to provide some very valuable information, and it's going to be an exciting year. Lastly, you can find all of the webinar presentations online on the 1800RESPECT site, and you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel. On behalf of the entire 1800RESPECT team, I thank you for attending this webinar and hope you have found it valuable. Please stay online now to take our quick survey. Thank you. Until next time.